Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Every spring, your social media feeds get completely flooded with these incredibly confident memes claiming that Easter is actually a stolen pagan holiday. But what if I told you that the entire historical evidence for the ancient pagan goddess Eostre comes from just one single paragraph written by an 8th century monk? And the real twist ending here is that most of those modern internet myths you see about Easter's pagan origins, well, they were actually invented out of thin air by a 19th century anti-Catholic activist. And today, in this massive stroke of irony, those manufactured myths are being unknowingly parroted as historical fact by modern internet atheists to dunk on religion.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating situation. We are looking at a massive global narrative that has been built on a foundation that is, well, it's astonishingly thin. It's really a prime example of how bad history survives when it just happens to confirm our modern biases.
Right, exactly. So our mission today is to completely demolish that thin foundation for you. We are pulling from deep historical and linguistic analyses of Anglo-Saxon religion and early Christian history, especially focusing on the groundbreaking work of scholars like Dr. Philip Shaw. We're going to separate historical reality from viral pseudo-history, basically equipping you to be the smartest person in the room the next time someone brings up the pagan origins of Easter. Also, quick housekeeping, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button, because understanding how a 19th century conspiracy theory became a 21st century viral atheist meme, well, it requires some serious detective work on this deep dive. Let's start by confronting the memes themselves.
Good place to start.
Yeah, we have to dismiss the absolute nonsense right out of the gate. Specifically, there's this incredibly popular claim that the word Easter comes from the ancient Near Eastern goddess Ishtar.
Right, the Ishtar meme. I mean, that claim is just completely untethered from reality. It relies entirely on, well, an etymological coincidence. It just happens to sound vaguely similar to modern English years.
Oh, for sure. Like, just because two words sound alike now doesn't mean anything historically.
Exactly. There is absolutely zero historical, linguistic, or cultural connection between a Mesopotamian deity and an English holiday.
Yeah.
I mean, to suggest Ishtar became Easter is, it's like suggesting the country of Turkey was named after the Thanksgiving bird.
That's a great way to put it.
It just represents this fundamental misunderstanding of how languages actually evolve, over thousands of years across vastly different language families.
That makes total sense. So the Ishtar connection is just bad wordplay. But then we get to the claims that are, I think, much trickier to handle because they do contain a tiny sliver of truth.
Right, the Eostre claim.
Exactly. The claim is that Easter is linked to an ancient pagan goddess named Eostre, who was supposedly this blonde-haired fertility goddess associated with the dawn. The meme tells us her sacred symbols were bunnies and eggs, and that the early Christians just cynically co-opted her whole spring festival.
Yeah, and unpacking that sliver of truth requires some really careful synthesis of actual scholarship. Because looking at the historical facts, the symbols people so confidently link to this ancient goddess, the eggs and the rabbits, are completely anachronistic.
Meaning they don't even belong in the same time period.
Exactly. They do not belong together at all.
Yeah.
Eggs were not associated with Easter until the medieval period, which is, centuries after the Anglo-Saxons were Christianized.
Wow, okay.
And rabbits show up in the historical record even later than that. So any claim trying to connect Eostre to bunnies is just baseless speculation. It's often just projected backward from our modern commercial traditions.
Which brings us to the actual historical evidence we have that this goddess Eostre ever existed in the first place. And I am not exaggerating here for dramatic effect for you guys. The total historical record is one single paragraph.
That's right, one paragraph.
It was written by an 8th century Christian monk from Northumbria, known as the Venerable Bede. I really want you to picture this. It is literally like a historian thousands of years in the future trying to reconstruct an entire complex 21st century global religion, and their only surviving source material is one obscure, isolated tweet.
It's a great analogy. And the context of that single paragraph is vital for understanding why Bede even mentioned her in the first place. So Bede lived in the late 600s and early 700s, and he wrote a highly complex book called The Reckoning of Time.
Which, just to be clear, was not a book about pagan mythology.
No, not at all. It was essentially a technical manual for computing time. You see, early Christians spent an enormous amount of intellectual energy trying to calculate the correct future dates of Easter.
Because it's notoriously difficult mathematics, right? Since Jesus was executed around the Jewish holiday of Passover, which operates on a lunar solar calendar, while the Roman world operated on a purely solar calendar.
Exactly. You're trying to sync up two very different ways of tracking time.
And a lunar solar calendar requires constant adjustment. Like Passover changes every year on the solar calendar because it's tied to the first full moon of the first month of the Jewish year. It's a completely moving target, which means the early Christians had to build these complex mathematical tables to figure out when the holiday would actually land years in advance.
Right. And so Bede is writing this bewildering, highly complex book discussing ancient calendars, the movement of the sun and moon, and the shifting of the seasons, all to basically help his fellow clerics pin down the date of their most important holiday.
Right.
And buried deep in this technical manual, he does a comparative analysis between the Roman Julian calendar and the local Anglo-Saxon lunar calendar. He lists the Anglo-Saxon months and just explains the origins of their names.
Yeah, he lists things like the month of 3 milkings for the time of year when cattle were producing so much they had to be milked 3 times a day, or the month of weeds. He's really just providing an etymological dictionary for the local calendar.
Exactly. And when he gets to the equivalent of April, he calls it Eosturmonath. He explicitly writes that it was named after a goddess of theirs named Eostre, in whose honor feasts were once celebrated in that month.
Okay, so that's the reference.
Yes. And he then notes a cultural shift, explaining that Christians now designate the season of Jesus' resurrection by her name, basically calling the joys of the new rite by the time-honored name of the old observance. And that is it. That is the entirety of our historical record.
It's wild.
The world's knowledge of Eostre begins and ends with those few Latin sentences.
See, but this raises an immediate red flag for me. Wait, if this is literally the only mention of her in all of ancient history, how do we know Bede didn't just invent her to explain the month's name? Because he's writing long after these supposed pagan festivals had disappeared. He isn't an eyewitness to pagan worship, so maybe he just didn't know why the month was called Eosturmonath, so he reverse-engineered a goddess to fill the gap in his manuscript.
And that is a very fair point. In fact, for a large part of the 20th century, many prominent scholars assumed exactly that. In the mid-1990s, the prevailing academic view dismissed Eostre as just an etymological fancy on Bede's part.
Okay, so I'm not crazy for thinking that.
Not at all. It is a highly rational critique. If an ancient author encounters a word they don't understand, inventing an ancient deity to explain it is a fairly common historical trope. But if Bede is our only text, well, the textual road just ends there. We have to leave pure manuscript history behind and utilize the tools of historical linguistics and archaeology.
Let's trace how people tried to solve this mystery, because the first major attempt feels like it spawned a lot of the romanticized myths we see on social media today. So in the 19th century, Jacob Grimmius, the same guy from the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, decided to tackle the Eostre problem. He published a massive study in 1835 called Teutonic Mythology.
Right. And Grimm noticed that modern Germans called the Christian holiday of Easter Osterun in Old High German. Using a rather aggressive linguistic assumption, he theorized that there must have been a massive pan-Germanic goddess named Ostara.
Ostara, okay.
Because the root of the word seemed tied to the east, and the east is where the sun rises, he just declared she was a goddess of the radiant dawn, of upspringing light. He painted this beautiful, sweeping picture of a widespread continental pagan religion that the Christians absorbed as they moved north.
Grimm's theory sounds incredibly neat, honestly almost too neat. It feels a bit like reverse engineering a puzzle to fit the picture on the box, you know?
Yeah.
He took the name of a Christian festival in Germany, combined it with Bede's one paragraph in England, and fabricated a massive global dawn goddess out of thin air to bridge the gap.
That's exactly what he did. There is zero direct evidence for a goddess named Ostara anywhere in the Germanic world. Zero. Grimm was operating in the era of 19th century Romantic nationalism. Scholars of his time were desperate to find a unified, grand, pre-Christian mythology for the Germanic peoples that could basically rival the Greek and Roman pantheons. So it was highly educated speculation, driven by cultural desire, but it remained just that speculation.
But if Grimm's massive dawn goddess was just highly educated guesswork, what happens when we apply modern forensic linguistics to that same evidence? This is where Dr. Philip Shaw enters the picture. In 2011, he published Pagan Goddesses in the Germanic World, and he completely dismantles that 19th century romanticism.
He really does. Shaw's methodology strips away the poetry and focuses on the hard data of language and geography. He examines the etymological root of the name Eostre and argues it simply derives from a localized Old English word meaning Eastern.
Just Eastern.
Just Eastern. He doesn't make the massive leap to radiant dawn or springtime fertility. He just anchors the word to basic geography.
And to back this up, Shaw looks at comparative archaeological evidence from mainland Europe. Specifically, there was a massive discovery made in Germany in 1958. Archaeologists unearthed about 150 Roman-Germanic inscriptions, dating back to around 150 to 250 CE. These altars were dedicated to beings called the Matronae Austriahenae, which translates to the Eastern matrons, or the matrons of the Easterners.
Right, and understanding these specific matron cults across the Roman Empire changes the entire paradigm here. These were not universal deities. They were localized ancestor cults, deeply embedded in specific tribal politics and geography.
Wait, what does that mean practically?
Well, a matron cult was almost always tied to a very narrow geographic location, like, say, a specific river bend or a single settlement.
So ancient religious cults were less like global pop culture phenomena and more like hyper-local sports fandoms. Because we tend to think of ancient gods like Marvel superheroes, right? Where everyone in the empire knows exactly who Jupiter or Thor is. But the reality on the ground was that what was passionately worshipped in one village might be completely unknown to the people living just 2 towns over.
That is a perfect analogy. And Shaw applies this model directly to Eostre. He concludes she was not a massive, global, pan-Germanic goddess. She was likely a highly localized goddess tied to a very specific people or region in Kent, down in southeastern England.
Really? Just one region?
Yeah. There's even a civil parish there called Eostre, sitting on an ancient Roman road, which etymologically might literally mean district of Eostre. The archaeological evidence strongly points to pre-Christian religious life in England being made up of relatively small-scale social groupings, each with their own hyper-local deities.
Okay, but that brings up a massive contradiction for me. If Eostre was just a tiny hometown team in one small district in Kent, how on earth did her name become the English title for a massive global Christian holiday? How did a hyper-local goddess hijack the Christian calendar?
Answering that requires looking at the mechanics of cultural assimilation and the explicit strategies of the early church. We actually have a letter from Pope Gregory sent in 601 CE outlining a very specific psychological strategy for missionaries dealing with the Anglo-Saxon pagans.
Oh, interesting.
He advocated for a strategy of acculturation rather than pure destruction.
Which makes sense. He probably realized that if you just march in and burn down all the sacred temples, the locals are going to violently rebel. I mean, humans are deeply attached to their sacred spaces and their community calendar.
Exactly. Gregory instructed his missionaries not to tear down the pagan temples. Instead, they were told to cleanse them, sprinkle holy water, put an altar inside, and repurpose them as churches. And he applied the exact same psychological logic to their festivals.
So what did they do at the festivals?
He told the missionaries not to stop the feasts and the animal sacrifices. He basically said, let the people slaughter their oxen and have their community feast, but subtly shift the focus. Have them do it to celebrate Christian martyrs instead of pagan gods.
Wow. It's an incredibly pragmatic way to hijack a community's existing dopamine loop. You keep the party, you keep the food, you just change the guest of honor. So when April rolled around and the locals were already calling it Eosturmonath, the Christian missionaries didn't force them to adopt a new Latin month name. They just used the local vocabulary for the season where the resurrection happened to land.
Precisely. The persistence of a localized word does not equate to the persistence of the underlying religion. Using a pagan name for a month or a day is a completely common linguistic phenomenon that carries no theological weight for the speaker.
It feels like linguistic residue, kind of like how I'm not secretly worshiping Thor when I go to the gym on Thursday. It's literally Thor's Day, but the word has completely lost its religious context. Or Wednesday being Woden's Day, the words just stick around long after the gods are forgotten.
Exactly. Historians of the period, like Eleanor Parker, argue that the name Easter caught on widely across the English church simply as a marker of time, rapidly losing any pagan associations it might have briefly held in that one specific region of Kent.
And there is a mind-bending fact here that I think completely shatters the Easter as a pagan holiday meme. Using the word Easter is a strictly English-speaking quirk.
Yes, this is so important.
The vast majority of the global Christian world does not use the word Easter. They use variations of the Greek word Pascha, which is a direct derivation of the Hebrew word for Passover. I mean, the French say Pâques, the Italians say Pasqua, the Spanish say Pascua.
Right, and this linguistic reality destroys the premise of a global pagan conspiracy. By the 8th century, Christianity had already spread across Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and all the way along the Silk Road into China. So the idea that a tiny hyperlocal festival for a Kentish goddess somehow traveled backward in time and across the globe to influence the core theology of early Christians in the Middle East is historically ridiculous. It takes an incredibly narrow, Anglo-centric view of world history to believe that an entire global religious observance is based on an isolated English word.
Okay, so if the actual historical and linguistic evidence so clearly points to a localized linguistic hangover, why are these massive pagan Easter conspiracies so viral today? Where did this huge wave of disinformation actually originate?
Well, to find the true architect of the modern internet myth, we have to look at an early example of historical money laundering. In 1858, a 19th century Scottish minister named Alexander Hislop published a book called The Two Babylons.
The Two Babylons.
Yes. And this was not an honest historical inquiry. It was stridently, aggressively anti-Catholic propaganda. Hislop had a deep theological axe to grind, and he used blatant pseudo-history to try and prove that the Catholic Church was literally the continuation of the ancient evil religion of Babylon.
He essentially built a massive conspiracy board with red string connecting completely unrelated ancient cultures. He claimed that the worship of Canaanite gods like Baal was secretly transported to Britain by the Druids.
Right.
And then he used a technique of simple word association. He looked at the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, decided she sounded like the Canaanite goddess Astarte, and then decided Astarte sounded like the Anglo-Saxon goddess Eostre.
He just mashed vastly different cultures, thousands of years of separate history, and entirely different language families into a blender to attack the Pope. He concluded that the popular observances of Easter were completely Babylonian in character.
It's wild.
He invented a vast conspiratorial web linking Catholic practices to ancient Near Eastern fertility cults, completely ignoring actual empirical history, linguistics, and geography. He took a fake premise and passed it through a dense, scholarly-sounding book until it looked legitimate to a lay audience.
The irony here is absolutely dripping when we look at the intersection of modern atheism and historical skepticism. You have modern internet skeptics, people who really pride themselves on logic, science, and empirical evidence, making these viral videos to deconstruct Christianity and prove that religious holidays are just stolen pagan rituals. And what are they actually doing? They are unknowingly weaponizing the literal propaganda of a 19th century Christian fundamentalist.
It is a profound irony, and it really highlights the dangers of confirmation bias. Many modern critics of religion believe they are using objective history to dismantle Christian traditions. But because they don't trace the citations back to their origin, they end up participating in Hislop's religious zealotry.
Yeah.
Hislop's book is basically the 1850s equivalent of a viral TikTok conspiracy video. It is sensational, it relies on words that sound vaguely similar, and most importantly, it confirms the pre-existing biases of the reader.
Exactly. If you are a skeptic who already wants to believe that religious institutions are just cynical power grabs built on stolen myths, then Hislop's fake history sounds exactly like the secret truth you've been looking for. It bypassed their critical thinking filters because it gave them exactly the conclusion they wanted.
And the problem is, ancient history is a rigorous empirical discipline. It requires hard evidence, textual analysis, archaeology, and peer review. It's not about finding two words that sound similar and deciding one birthed the other.
Right.
When it comes to the goddess Eostre, the only hard textual evidence we have in the entire world is Bede's single paragraph. Everything beyond that paragraph is either responsible linguistic reconstruction, like Philip Shaw's work pointing to a local Kentish deity, or it is totally irresponsible fiction, like Hislop's Babylonian conspiracy.
Let's synthesize this journey for you, the listener, navigating this massive sea of information. The grand pagan origins of Easter, with the dawn goddess and the bunnies and the Ishtar connections, they just do not exist. What we actually have is an English linguistic hangover. A tiny, hyperlocal goddess in Kent had a name that stuck to the month of April, and the English-speaking church simply kept using the local vocabulary for the season.
The historical reality shows that cultures blend and language is incredibly sticky, but it absolutely does not mean a massive pagan fertility cult secretly underpins a global Christian celebration.
Not at all.
The real history, like the discovery of those 150 Roman-Germanic altars to the Eastern matrons, tells us so much more about the diverse, localized reality of human belief than the flattened-out, weaponized internet myths do.
We live in an era of unprecedented information overload, which means a healthy skepticism of viral history is absolutely essential. Actual history is complex, it is highly nuanced, and it requires hard evidence, not just catchy memes that fit neatly onto a smartphone screen. If a historical claim sounds too perfectly tailored to dunk on a specific group, it usually is. I want to leave you with a final, lingering question to ponder today. We talked about how Bede's single paragraph is the only reason we even know the word Eostre today. I want you to look around at your own daily life. What everyday words, casual traditions, or hyperlocal slang do you participate in right now that might completely baffle a historian 1,000 years from now if they only had one surviving paragraph to explain what you believed? Because as we've seen on this deep dive, when the diagnostic tools of history are limited, the reality of human culture can hide some truly wild stories. Keep thinking deeper.